The smell of charcoal and barbecue sauce filled the warm California air as I walked through my parents' backyard gate, still wearing dirt-stained jeans from the morning's cleanup. 3 days had passed since I discovered what Jessica had done to my garden, and the family gathering felt like walking into a courtroom where I was already guilty. My brother David stood by the grill, flipping burgers while Jessica lounged in a patio chair, her perfectly manicured nails catching the sunlight as she gestured animatedly to whoever would listen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I could hear Jessica's voice carrying across the yard before I even reached the main group. Honestly, it was just weeds and random plants everywhere, she was saying to my cousin Emma, who nodded sympathetically while sipping her iced tea. The kids needed somewhere safe to play, and that little patch of dirt wasn't doing anyone any good. Sarah acts like I destroyed something precious, but really, I did her a favor by cleaning it up. My mother Linda hurried over as soon as she spotted me, her face wearing that familiar expression of forced cheerfulness that appeared whenever family drama threatened her perfect gatherings. "Sarah, honey, you made it. I was worried you might not come after, well, you know." She glanced nervously toward Jessica, who had now captured Uncle Jim's attention with her animated retelling of the garden incident. "I wouldn't miss Dad's birthday barbecue," I replied, accepting her quick hug while trying to ignore the sympathetic looks from other relatives who had clearly already heard Jessica's version of events. The story was spreading through the family like wildfire, and I could see the subtle headshakes and whispered conversations that followed my arrival. David approached with a paper plate loaded with food, his expressions somewhere between apologetic and defensive. "Look, Sarah, I know you're upset about the garden thing, but Jessica was just trying to make space for the kids' new pool. She didn't realize how much work you'd put into those plants." His tone suggested he was repeating an explanation he'd been giving all week, trying to keep peace in his own household while managing the fallout with his sister. "Those plants," I said quietly, taking the plate he offered, "were apparently more important to me than they were to anyone else." The dismissive phrase stung more than I wanted to admit. What Jessica had destroyed in a single afternoon represented years of careful planning, cultivation, and research that no one in my family had ever bothered to understand. Cousin Mark wandered over, beer in hand, with that particular smile people wear when they're about to offer unwanted advice. "You know, Sarah, maybe this is a blessing in disguise. You spend so much time digging around in the dirt, maybe now you can focus on getting your life together. Find a real job, meet someone nice. Mom says you're 34 and still single, living in that tiny place." His words carried the casual cruelty of family members who mistake familiarity for permission to judge. I watched Jessica demonstrate to a growing audience how she'd efficiently cleared away what she called overgrown weeds to make room for the children's inflatable pool. Her gestures were broad and confident, painting herself as the practical hero who'd solved a neighborhood eyesore while prioritizing family needs. The gathered relatives nodded approvingly, clearly siding with the mother who'd put children's happiness above one woman's gardening hobby. "She's always been different," Aunt Carol murmured to my mother, not quite quietly enough. "Remember how she used to collect those weird rocks and leaves as a child? Some people just never grow out of their odd phases. At least Jessica understands what really matters in life." The word "different" landed like an accusation, carrying decades of family gatherings where my interests had been dismissed as quirky at best, concerning at worst. The afternoon sun beat down on my shoulders as I stood at the edge of my own family's judgment, holding a plate of barbecue I had no appetite for, surrounded by people who saw my devastation as Jessica's reasonable decision. They had no idea what they were actually talking about, and part of me wondered if I should even bother explaining. But as Jessica launched into another detailed description of her efficient cleanup methods, something inside me decided it was finally time to set the record straight. The conversation around Jessica grew louder as more relatives joined her circle, each one eager to hear about the neighborhood drama that had apparently become the day's entertainment. My father Robert emerged from the house carrying a fresh pitcher of lemonade, his face already showing signs of the diplomatic exhaustion that came with managing family conflicts during what was supposed to be his birthday celebration. "There she is," he said with forced brightness, setting down the pitcher and giving me a quick shoulder squeeze. Your mother was worried you might skip the party after all this garden business. I told her, you're tougher than that. His attempt at normalcy felt strained, and I could see the plea in his eyes for everyone to just get along for one afternoon. Jessica's voice rose above the general chatter as she described her cleanup process to an increasingly supportive audience. You should have seen the mess, truly. Plants growing in every direction, with no organization whatsoever. I spent 6 hours pulling up roots and clearing pathways, just so the children could have a safe place to play. Some of those bushes were actually scratching the kids when they tried to retrieve their toys. Emma shook her head in apparent disbelief. 6 hours? Sarah, you must have really let things get out of control over there. I can't imagine having such an overgrown yard that it would take that long to clean up basic landscaping. Her tone carried the particular judgment of someone who prided herself on maintaining a pristine suburban lawn with weekly professional service. Uncle Jim chimed in with his characteristic bluntness. Kids need space to be kids, not some jungle gym made of thorns and weeds. Jessica did what any responsible parent would do. Sometimes adults have to make tough decisions for the good of the children. His declaration received nods of approval from the gathered family members, solidifying the narrative that Jessica was the hero and I was the selfish obstacle. David shifted uncomfortably beside his wife, clearly caught between loyalty to his sister and support for his spouse's actions. The thing is, Sarah never really explained what she was trying to accomplish out there. From our kitchen window, it just looked like random plants everywhere. We had no idea there was supposed to be some kind of system to it. His explanation felt like an attempt to soften the blow while still justifying the destruction. A system? I asked quietly, setting down my untouched plate on a nearby table. The casual dismissal of years of work as random chaos stung more than the physical destruction itself. Is that what you thought I was doing out there? Just randomly throwing plants around? Aunt Carol leaned forward with the expression of someone delivering helpful criticism. Honey, we all know you love your little gardening hobby, but there's a difference between a few flower pots and letting your property look like an abandoned lot. Jessica showed initiative by taking care of a problem that was affecting the whole neighborhood. Her words carried the weight of family consensus, as if they'd all been talking about my supposed neglect for months. The group's attention shifted between Jessica's continued explanations and my increasingly uncomfortable silence. I watched my sister-in-law demonstrate how she'd efficiently removed what she called overgrown shrubs that were apparently blocking natural foot traffic patterns. Her audience responded with appreciative comments about her practical approach and consideration for child safety. Really, Sarah, Jessica said, finally addressing me directly with a tone of patient explanation. I understand you're upset, but you have to see reason here. Those plants were completely impractical for a residential area. Half of them looked dead anyway, and the ones that were alive were creating hiding spots where the children could get hurt or lost. I'm actually surprised your landlord hadn't already complained about the property maintenance issues. Mark nodded sagely, as if Jessica had revealed some profound truth about responsible homeownership. That's exactly right. Property values in this neighborhood depend on everyone maintaining reasonable standards. One overgrown yard can affect everyone's investment. His comments sparked murmurs of agreement from relatives who clearly viewed my gardening efforts as a community liability rather than a personal project. The weight of their collective judgment settled over the gathering like the warm California afternoon heat. Everyone seemed convinced that Jessica had performed a necessary service, cleaning up my neglectful mess while prioritizing children's needs over one woman's impractical hobby. Their certainty was absolute, their narrative complete, and their sympathy entirely directed toward Jessica's burden of dealing with an unreasonable sister-in-law who couldn't accept generous help when it was offered. The afternoon heat intensified as Jessica's audience expanded to include nearly every adult at the gathering. Even the teenagers had paused their phone scrolling to listen to what had become the day's main entertainment. My cousin's wife Rachel joined the circle, immediately jumping into the conversation with the enthusiasm of someone who'd just discovered juicy family gossip. Wait, so you actually went over there and cleaned up her entire yard by yourself? Rachel asked Jessica with obvious admiration. That must have been exhausting work. How thoughtful of you to take that on when she clearly wasn't managing it herself. Her tone suggested that Jessica deserved some kind of community service award for her efforts. Jessica waved dismissively, though her pleased smile suggested she was enjoying the praise. It wasn't that difficult once I got started. Most of it was just pulling up weeds that had taken over everything. The hardest part was hauling away all the dead branches and dried up plants that were creating fire hazards. Living in California, we all have to think about these safety issues. Her mention of fire safety drew concerned nods from the group, adding another layer of justification to her actions. My mother approached me with a fresh glass of lemonade and the expression she wore when trying to smooth over family tensions. Maybe we should all just focus on enjoying Dad's birthday, she suggested quietly, though her voice carried far enough for others to hear. Sarah, I'm sure Jessica meant well. You know how she is with the children. She just wants them to have a safe place to play. A safe place to play, I repeated, the phrase tasting bitter in my mouth. The implication that my garden had been dangerous felt like another deliberate mischaracterization of what I'd spent years creating. But trying to explain the truth felt increasingly pointless as the family narrative solidified around Jessica's version of events. David's colleague Steve, who'd been invited to the barbecue through some workplace friendship, felt comfortable enough to offer his perspective as an outsider. You know, as someone who doesn't have family history here, I have to say Jessica's approach sounds completely reasonable. Property maintenance is a real responsibility, and when it starts affecting neighbors, sometimes intervention is necessary. His comment as a neutral observer seemed to carry extra weight with the gathered relatives. Uncle Jim seized on this validation with obvious satisfaction. Exactly what I've been saying. This isn't about hurt feelings or family drama. It's about being a responsible member of the community. Sarah, you're 34 years old, living in a cottage that looks like it belongs in some fairy tale instead of a respectable neighborhood. At some point, you have to grow up and consider how your choices affect other people. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The casual cruelty of his words hung in the warm air, while several family members exchanged glances that seemed to say they'd all been thinking the same thing. My living situation had apparently been a topic of family discussion long before the garden incident, with my choices viewed as evidence of general life failure rather than deliberate decisions. Emma's husband Tom, emboldened by the group dynamic, decided to add his own observations. I drove past your place last week, and honestly, I couldn't tell where the property lines were supposed to be. Everything was so overgrown that it looked like the plants were trying to take over the sidewalk. Jessica probably saved the whole block from having to deal with code enforcement complaints. Code enforcement, Aunt Carol repeated with alarm. Sarah, you could have gotten the whole family in trouble with the city if neighbors had started filing complaints about property maintenance. Thank goodness Jessica stepped in when she did. Her scenario painted Jessica as having prevented some kind of municipal crisis through her quick thinking and decisive action. The conversation had evolved beyond simple support for Jessica's decision into a comprehensive critique of my lifestyle choices. Every aspect of my life seemed suddenly open for family evaluation, from my housing decisions to my apparent inability to maintain basic property standards. The garden destruction had become merely the latest example of my general failure to meet adult responsibilities. Jessica basked in the growing support, occasionally adding details about the cleanup process that made her sound increasingly heroic. Really, the amount of work involved was tremendous. I had to rent a truck just to haul away all the debris. But seeing the children's faces when they realized they'd have space for their pool made every bit of effort worthwhile. Her sacrifice for the sake of family happiness seemed to resonate deeply with the gathered relatives. The barbecue smoke drifted across the patio as more neighbors began arriving for what had turned into an impromptu block party. Mrs. Henderson, from 3 houses down, approached Jessica with obvious curiosity, having clearly heard portions of the conversation from her own yard. Jessica, dear, I heard you talking about cleaning up that overgrown lot next to your house. What a blessing that must be for the whole street. Jessica straightened with renewed energy at this validation from outside the family. Oh, Mrs. Henderson, you have no idea what a project it was. The previous situation was really getting concerning from a neighborhood perspective. Plants were growing completely wild, attracting all sorts of insects and creating privacy issues. I finally decided someone needed to take action for everyone's benefit. The elderly neighbor nodded knowingly while glancing in my direction with barely concealed disapproval. I've been wondering when someone would address that situation. My herald mentioned just last month how that property was starting to look like something from those hoarding shows on television. Completely inappropriate for our community standards. Her words carried the authority of someone who'd lived on the block for decades and appointed herself its unofficial quality control manager. My father attempted another diplomatic intervention, sensing the conversation was spiraling beyond family dynamics into neighborhood politics. Now, let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. Sarah's always been creative with her projects, and Jessica was just trying to help the kids have fun. Maybe we can find some middle ground here. His suggestion fell flat as more neighbors continued arriving and joining the discussion. Mr. Peterson from across the street had apparently been listening from his own backyard and felt compelled to add his perspective. I was actually planning to call the homeowners association about that property. Whatever was growing over there was starting to affect property values for all of us. These botanical experiments might be interesting to some people, but they don't belong in established residential neighborhoods. The mention of the homeowners association sent a visible chill through my family members, who clearly viewed this as escalation beyond acceptable levels. David looked genuinely panicked at the thought of official complaints being filed against his sister, while my mother's face showed the particular strain of someone watching a family gathering transform into a community intervention. Jessica seized on this new support with obvious satisfaction. That's exactly what I was trying to prevent. Sometimes family members have to step in before situations reach the point where outside authorities get involved. I was actually protecting Sarah from potentially embarrassing consequences while giving the children a proper play area. Her reframing of the destruction as protective family intervention rather than property damage seemed to resonate with the growing audience. Rachel's mother, who'd apparently been summoned by phone to hear the story firsthand, arrived with her own opinions about residential property management. In my day, neighbors looked out for each other by maintaining appropriate standards. If someone in the family wasn't keeping up their responsibilities, relatives stepped in to help, rather than letting things deteriorate until strangers had to intervene. Her generational perspective added weight to Jessica's actions as traditional family values in practice. The conversation expanded to include detailed discussions of neighborhood aesthetic standards, property maintenance obligations, and the responsibilities of family members to prevent community embarrassment. My garden had become a symbol of larger issues about residential cooperation and social responsibility, with Jessica positioned as the practical hero who'd prevented neighborhood conflict through decisive action. Tom felt comfortable enough to share his own property management philosophy with the assembled group. Look, we all have hobbies and interests, but when you're living in a community, you have to consider how your personal choices affect everyone else. What might seem creative or natural to one person can look like neglect or disrespect to neighbors who've invested in maintaining property values. His words received approving nods from both family members and neighbors who joined the discussion. The weight of community judgment had transformed what began as family drama into a broader conversation about social obligations and residential responsibility. Everyone seemed convinced that Jessica had performed a necessary community service while protecting me from the embarrassment of official intervention. Their certainty was reinforced by each new voice that joined the conversation, creating an echo chamber of validation for Jessica's actions and criticism of my choices. Standing at the edge of this expanding circle of judgment, holding my warm lemonade and watching neighbors nod approvingly at descriptions of my destroyed garden, I realized the afternoon had become something much larger than a family barbecue disagreement. The circle of judgment had grown so large that it now encompassed most of the backyard, with Jessica holding court like a neighborhood hero receiving well-deserved recognition. Mrs. Chen from the corner house had just finished expressing her gratitude for Jessica's, quote, community-minded approach, when I finally decided it was time to speak up. I walked to the center of the gathering, setting my untouched lemonade on the patio table with enough force to create a small splash that caught everyone's attention. I need to share something with all of you, I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent yard. Since everyone seems so interested in discussing my property and Jessica's cleanup efforts, I think you should know exactly what was destroyed last Tuesday morning. The shift in my tone must have been noticeable, because even the children playing in the far corner of the yard seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. Jessica's confident smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered with a dismissive wave. Sarah, we've all heard your complaints about losing some plants. Everyone understands you're upset, but making a scene at Dad's birthday party isn't going to bring back your hobby garden. Her attempt to minimize my response drew supportive murmurs from several family members who clearly wanted to avoid further drama. My hobby garden, I repeated, pulling out my phone with steady hands. Is that what we're calling it? I opened my photo gallery and selected the folder I'd been hoping never to need. Let me show everyone exactly what Jessica's 6 hours of cleanup actually accomplished. The first image filled my screen before I turned it toward the gathered crowd. The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted from supportive approval to confusion as she stared at the photograph of my garden in full bloom just 1 week ago. The image showed carefully designed terraced beds filled with rare California native plants arranged in precise ecological zones, each section labeled with small brass markers indicating species names and cultivation dates. This is the Endangered Species Recovery Garden that the California Native Plant Society featured in their newsletter last month, I explained, swiping to the next image that showed the article headline clearly visible. Those weeds Jessica spent 6 hours removing included 3 plants that are extinct in the wild and exist only in cultivation. The dead-looking shrubs were actually dormant specimens of Catalina Island mountain lilac that I've been propagating for the botanical research program at UC Riverside. David's face had gone completely pale as he stared at the images on my phone. Sarah, you never told us it was anything official. We thought you were just, playing around with gardening. His voice carried the first hint of doubt about Jessica's heroic narrative, though he still seemed unable to grasp the full scope of what had been destroyed. I tried to tell you, I said, swiping to show images of the research documentation. Remember Christmas dinner when I mentioned my collaboration with the university's botanical department? You changed the subject to discuss Jessica's promotion. When I brought up the grant funding I'd received, Mom asked if I was finally ready to get a real job. The memories hung heavy in the warm afternoon air as family members began to realize how completely they'd dismissed my attempts to share my work. Jessica's voice had lost all its earlier confidence. But they looked like weeds. How was I supposed to know they were important? You should have put up signs or something, if they were so valuable. Her defensive protest sounded weak, even to her own ears, as she stared at photographs showing the careful layout and scientific documentation that had surrounded every plant. Signs, I said, scrolling to images of the small brass markers that had labeled each specimen with its scientific name, conservation status, and research purpose. You mean like these? The photographs clearly showed the professional labeling system that had been installed throughout the garden, each marker now visible in Jessica's debris pile like archaeological evidence of deliberate destruction. Mrs. Henderson's voice was barely audible as she studied the images on my phone. Dear God, child, this was a scientific research facility. We had no idea. When Jessica described cleaning up overgrown weeds, we thought she was talking about dandelions and crabgrass. Her horror was genuine as she began to understand that the neighborhood had been celebrating the destruction of something irreplaceable. The total replacement value, I continued, showing them the insurance documentation I'd been compiling for the past 3 days, is approximately $87,000. That's just the financial cost, not accounting for the 5 years of propagation work or the research data that was lost when the mature specimens were destroyed. The numbers seemed to echo across the silent patio as the full scope of Jessica's cleanup became clear. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.